The proportion which the usual market rate of interest ought to bear to the ordinary rate of clear profit necessarily varies as profit rises or falls. Double interest is in Great Britain reckoned what the merchants call a good, moderate, reasonable profit. Terms which I apprehend mean no more than a common and usual profit. In a country where the ordinary rate of clear profit is 8 or 10%, it may be reasonable that 1/2 of it should go to interest. Whatever business is carried on, the stock is at the risk of the borrower, who, as it were, insures it to the lender at 4 or 5%, may, in the greater part of trades, be both a sufficient profit upon the risk of this insurance and a sufficient recompense for the trouble of employing the stock. But the proportion between interest and clear profit might not be the same in countries where their ordinary rate of profit was either a good deal lower or a good deal higher. If it were a good deal lower, 1/2 of it perhaps could not be afforded for interest, and more might be afforded if it were a good deal higher. In countries which are fast advancing to riches, the low rate of profit may in the price of many commodities compensate the high wages of labor and enable those countries to sell as cheap as their less thriving neighbors, among whom the wages of labor may be lower. In reality, high profits tend much more to raise the price of work than high wages. If, in the linen manufacture, for example, the wages of the different working people, the flax dressers, the spinners, the weavers, etc., should all of them be advanced 2 pence a day, it would be necessary to heighten the price of a piece of linen only by a number of 2 pence equal to the number of people, that had been employed about it, multiplied by the number of days during which they had been so employed. That part of the price of the commodity, which resolved itself into wages, would, through all the different stages of the manufacturer, raise only an arithmetical proportion to this rise of wages. But if the profits of all the different employers of these people should be raised 5%, that part of the price of the commodity which resolved itself into profit would, through all the different stages of the manufacture, rise in geometrical proportion to this rise of profit. The employer of the flax dressers would, in selling his flax, require an additional 5% upon the whole value of the materials and wages which he advanced to his workmen. The employer of the spinners would require an additional 5%, both upon the advanced price of the flax and upon the wages of the spinners. And the employer of the weavers would require alike 5%, both upon the advanced price of the linen yarn and upon the wages of the weavers. In raising the price of commodities, the rise of wages operates in the same manner as the simple interest does in the accumulation of debt. The rise of profit operates like compound interest. Our merchants and master manufacturers complain much of the bad effects of high wages in raising the price and thereby lessening the sale of their goods, both at home and abroad. They say nothing concerning the bad effects of high profits, they are silent with regard to the pernicious effects of their own gains. They complain only of those of other people. Chapter 10, of wages and profit in the different employments of labor and stock. The whole of the advantages and disadvantages of the different employments of labor and stock must, in the same neighborhood, be either perfectly equal or continually tending to equality. If, in the same neighborhood, there was any employment evidently either more or less advantageous than the rest, so many people would crowd into it in the one case, and so many would desert it in the other, that its advantages would soon return to the level of other employments. This, at least, would be the case in a society where things were left to follow their natural course, where there was perfect liberty, and where every man was perfectly free both to choose what occupation he thought proper and to change it as often as he thought proper. Every man's interest would prompt him to seek the advantageous and to shun the disadvantageous employment. Pecuniary wages and profit, indeed, are everywhere in Europe extremely different. According to the different employments of labor and stock. But this difference arises partly from the certain circumstances in the employment themselves, which either really, or at least in the imagination of men, make up for a small pecuniary gain in some and counterbalance a great one in others, and partly from the policy of Europe, which nowhere leaves things at perfect liberty. The particular consideration of those circumstances and of that policy will divide this chapter into two parts. Part 1. Inequalities arising from the nature of employments themselves. The 5 following are the principal circumstances which, so far as I have been able to observe, make up for the small pecuniary gain in some employments, and counterbalance a great one in others. First, the agreeableness or disagreeableness of the employments themselves. Secondly, the easiness and cheapness, or the difficulty and expense of learning them. Thirdly, the constancy or inconstancy of employment in them. Fourthly, the small or great trust which must be reposed to those who exercise them. And fifthly, the probability or improbability of success in them. First, the wages of labor vary with the ease or hardship, the cleanliness or dirtiness, the honorableness or dishonorableness of the employment. Thus, in most places, take the year round, a journeyman tailor earns less than a journeyman weaver. His work is much easier. A journeyman weaver earns less than a journeyman smith. His work is not easier, but is much cleaner. A journeyman blacksmith, though an artificer, seldom earns so much in 12 hours as a collier who is only a laborer does in 8. His work is not quite so dirty, is less dangerous, and is carried on in daylight and above ground. Honor makes a great part of the reward of all honorable professions. In point of pecuniary gain, all things considered, they are generally under recompensed, as I shall endeavor to show by and by. Disgrace has the contrary effect. The trade of a butcher is a brutal and an odious business, but it is in most places more profitable than the greater part of common trades. The most detestable of all employments, that of public executioner, is in proportion to the quantity of work done, better paid than any common trade whatever. Hunting and fishing, the most important employments of mankind, in the rude state of society, become in its advanced state their most agreeable amusements. And they pursue, for pleasure, what they once followed from necessity. In the advanced state of society, therefore, they are all very poor people who follow as a trade what other people pursue as a pastime. Fishermen have been so since the time of Theocrates. A poacher is everywhere a very poor man in Great Britain. In countries where the rigor of the law suffers no poachers, the licensed hunter is not in a much better condition. The natural taste for those employments makes more people follow them than can live comfortably by them. And the produce of their labor, in proportion to its quantity, comes always too cheap to market to afford anything but the most scanty subsistence to the laborers. Disagreeableness and disgrace affect the profits of stock in the same manner as the wages of labor. The keeper of an inn or tavern, who is never master of his own house, and who is exposed to the brutality of every drunkard, exercises neither a very agreeable nor a very creditable business. But there is scarce any common trade in which a small stock yields so great a profit. Secondly, the wages of labor vary with the easiness and cheapness, or the difficulty and expense of learning the business. When any expensive machine is erected, the extraordinary work to be performed by it before it is worn out, it must be expected, will replace the capital laid out upon it, with at least the ordinary profits. A man educated at the expense of much labor and much time to any of those employments which require extraordinary dexterity and skill may be compared to one of those expensive machines. The work which he learns to perform, it must be expected, over and above the usual wages of a common laborer, will replace to him the whole expense of his education, with at least the ordinary profits of an equally valuable capital. It must do this too, in a reasonable time, regard being had to the very uncertain duration of human life, in the same manner as to the more certain duration of the machine. The difference between the wages of skilled labor and those of common labor is founded upon this principle. The policy of Europe considers labor of all mechanics, artificers, and manufacturers as skilled labor, and that all the country laborers as common labor. It seems to suppose that of the former to be of a more nice and delicate nature than of the latter. It is so perhaps in some cases, but in the greater part it is quite otherwise, as I shall endeavor to show by and by. The laws and customs of Europe, therefore, in order to qualify any person for exercising the one species of labor, impose the necessity of an apprenticeship, though with different degrees of rigor, in different places. They leave the other free and open to everybody. During the continuance of the apprenticeship, the whole labor of the apprentice belongs to his master, In the meantime, he must, in many cases, be maintained by his parents or relations, and in almost all cases must be clothed by them. Some money, too, is commonly given to the master for teaching him his trade. They who cannot give money give time, or become bound for more than the usual number of years, a consideration which, though it is not always advantageous to the master on account of the usual idleness of apprentices, is always disadvantageous to the apprentice. In country labor, on the contrary, the laborer, while he is employed about the easier, learns the more difficult parts of his business, and his own labor maintains him through all the different stages of his employment. It is reasonable, therefore, that in Europe the wages of mechanics, artificers, and manufacturers should be somewhat higher than those of common laborers. They are so accordingly.
Impressed thoroughly.
They are so accordingly, and their superior gains make them, in most places, to be considered as a superior rank. This superiority, however, is generally very small, and daily or weekly earnings of journeymen in the more common sorts of manufactures, such as those of plain linen and woolen cloth, computed at an average, are, in most places, very little more than the day wages of common laborers. Their employment, indeed, is more steady and uniform, and the superiority of their earnings, taking the whole year together, may be somewhat greater. It seems evidently, however, to be no greater than what is sufficient to compensate the superior expense of their education. Education in the ingenious arts and in the liberal professions is still more tedious and expensive. The pecuniary recompense, therefore, of painters and sculptors, of lawyers and physicians, ought to be much more liberal. You can just pull it off. One branch, either of foreign or domestic trade, cannot well be much more intricate business than another. Thirdly, the wages of labor in different occupations vary with the constancy or inconstancy of employment. Employment is much more constant in some trades than in others. In the greater part of the manufactures, a journeyman may be pretty sure of employment almost every day of the year that he's able to work. A mason or bricklayer, on the contrary, can work neither in hard frost nor in foul weather, and his employment at all other times depends upon the occasional calls of his customers. He is liable, in consequence, to be frequently without any. What he earns, therefore, while he is employed, must not only maintain him while he is idle, but make him some compensation for those anxious and desponding moments which the thought of so precarious a situation must sometimes occasion. Where the computed earnings of the greater part of the manufacturers, accordingly, are nearly upon a level with the day wages of common laborers, those of masons and bricklayers frequently earn 7 are generally from 1/2 more to double those wages, where common laborers earn 4 or 5 shillings a week. Masons and bricklayers frequently earn 7 and 8, where the former earn 6, the latter earn 9 or 10. And where the former earn 9 or 10, as in London, the latter commonly earn 15 and 18. No species of skilled labor, however, seems more easy to learn than that of masons and bricklayers. Chairmen in London during the summer season are said sometimes to be employed as bricklayers. The high wages of those workmen, therefore, are not so much the recompense of their skill as the compensation for the inconstancy of their employment. A house carpenter seems to exercise rather a nicer and more ingenious trade than the mason. In most places, however, for it is not universally so, his day wages are somewhat lower. His employment, though it depends much, does not depend so entirely upon the occasional calls of his customers, and it is not liable to be interrupted by the weather. When the trades which generally afford constant employment happen in a particular place not to do so, the wages of the workmen always rise a good deal above their ordinary proportion to those of common labor. In London, almost all journeyman artificers are liable to be called upon and dismissed by their masters from day to day and from week to week, in the same manner as day laborers in other places. The lowest order of artificers, journeyman tailors, accordingly, earn their 1/2 crown a day, though 18 pence may be reckoned the wages of a common laborer. In small towns and country villages, the wages of journeyman tailors frequently scarce equal those of the common laborer. But in London, they are often many weeks without employment, particularly during the summer. When the inconstancy of employment is combined with the hardship, disagreeableness, and dirtiness of the work, it sometimes raises the wages of the most common labor above those of the most skillful artificers. A collier working by the piece is supposed at Newcastle to earn commonly about double, and in many parts of Scotland about 3 times the wages of a common laborer. His high wages arise altogether from the hardship, disagreeableness, and dirtiness of his work. His employment may, upon most occasions, be as constant as he pleases. The coal heavers in London exercise a trade which, in hardship, dirtiness, and disagreeableness, almost equals that of colliers, and from the unavoidable irregularity in the arrivals of coal ships, the employment of the greater part of them is necessarily very inconstant. If colliers, therefore, commonly earn double and triple the wages of a common laborer, it ought not to seem unreasonable that coal heavers should earn nearly 4 and 5 times those wages. In the inquiry made into their condition a few years ago, it was found that at the rate at which they were paid, they could earn from 6 to 7 shillings a day. 6 shillings are about 4 times the wages of a common laborer in London, and in every particular trade, the lowest common earnings may always be considered as those of the far greater number. How extravagant soever those earnings may appear, if they were more than sufficient to compensate all the disagreeable circumstances of the business, there would soon be so great a number of competitors as in a trade which has no exclusive privilege would quickly reduce them to a lower rate. The constancy or inconstancy of employment cannot affect the ordinary profits of stock in any particular trade. Whether the stock is or is not constantly employed depends not upon the trade, but the trader. Fourthly, the wages of labor vary according to the small or great trust which must be reposed in the workman. The wages of goldsmiths and jewelers are everywhere superior to those of many other workmen, not only of equal, but of much superior ingenuity, on account of the precious materials with which they are entrusted. We trust our health to the physician, our fortune, and sometimes our life and reputation to the lawyer and attorney. Such confidence could not safely be reposed in people of a very mean or low condition. Their reward must be such, therefore, as may give them that rank in the society which so important a trust requires. The long time and great expense which must be laid out in their education, when combined with this circumstance, necessarily enhance still further the price of their labor. When a person employs only his own stock in trade, there is no trust, and the credit which he may get from other people depends not upon the nature of the trade, but upon their opinion of his fortune, probity, and prudence. The different rates of profit, therefore, in the different branches of trade cannot arise from the different degrees of trust reposed in the traders. Fifthly, the wages of labor in different employments vary according to the probability or improbability of success in them. The probability that any particular person shall ever be qualified for the employments to which he is educated is very different in different occupations. In the greatest part of mechanic trades, success is almost certain, but very uncertain in the liberal professions. Put your son apprentice to a shoemaker, and there is little doubt of his learning to make a pair of shoes. But send him to study the law, and it is least 20 to 1 if he ever makes such proficiency as will enable him to live by the business. In a perfectly fair lottery, those who draw the prizes ought to gain. All is lost by those who draw the blanks. In a profession where 20 fail for one that succeeds, that one ought to gain all that should have been gained by the unsuccessful 20. The counselor at law who perhaps at near 40 years of age begins to make something by his profession ought to receive the retribution not only of his own so tedious and expensive education, but of that of more than 20 others who are never likely to make anything by it. How extravagant soever the fees of counselors at law may sometimes appear, their real retribution is never equal to this. Compute in any particular place what is likely to be annually gained and what is likely to be annually spent by all the different workmen in any common trade, that such as that of shoemakers or weavers, and you will find that the former sum will generally exceed the latter. But make the same computation with regard to all the counselors and students of law, and you will find that their annual gains bear but a very small proportion to their annual expense. Even though you rate the former as high and the latter as low, as can well be done, the lottery of the law, therefore, is very far from being a perfectly fair lottery. And that as well as many other liberal and honorable professions is the point of pecuniary gain, evidently under recompensed. Those professions keep their level, however, with their occupations. Those professions keep their level, however, with other occupations, and notwithstanding these discouragements, all the most generous and liberal spirits are eager to crowd into them. Two different causes contribute to recommend them. First, the desire of the reputation which attends upon superior excellence in any of them, and secondly, the natural confidence which every man has, more or less, not only in his own abilities, but in his own good fortune. To excel in any profession in which but few arrive at mediocrity, it is the most decisive mark of what is called genius, or superior talents. The public admiration which attends upon such distinguished abilities makes always a part of their reward, a greater or smaller in proportion, as it is higher or lower in degree. It makes a considerable part of that reward in the profession of the physician, a still greater part in that of the law. In poetry and philosophy, it makes almost the whole. There are some very agreeable and beautiful talents, of which the possession commands a certain sort of admiration, but of which the exercise for the sake of gain is considered, whether from reason or prejudice, as a sort of public prostitution. The pecuniary recompense, therefore, of those who exercise them in this manner must be sufficient not only to pay for the time, labor, and expense of acquiring the talents, but for the discredit which attends the employment of them as the means of subsistence. The exorbitant rewards of players, opera singers, opera dancers, etc., are founded upon two principles: the rarity and beauty of the talents, and the discredit of employing them in this manner. It seems absurd at first sight that we should despise their persons and yet reward their talents with the most profuse liberality. While we do the one, however, we must of necessity do the other. Should the public opinion or prejudice ever alter with regard to such occupations, their pecuniary recompense would quickly diminish. More people would apply to them, and the competition would quickly reduce the price of their labor. Such talents, though, far from being common, are by no means so rare as imagined. Many people possess them in great perfection, who disdain to make use of them, and many more are capable of acquiring them, and, if anything, could be made honorably by them. The overweening conceit which the greater part of men have of their own abilities is an ancient evil remarked by the philosophers and moralists of all ages. Their absurd presumption in their own good fortune has been less taken notice of. However, if possible, still more universal. There is no man living who, when in tolerable health and spirits, has not some share of it. The chance of gain is by every man more or less overvalued, and the chance of loss is by most men undervalued, and by scarce any man who is in tolerable health and spirits valued more than it's worth.